Everyone please take their seats. Thank you. Good evening. We'd like to start. Good evening and welcome to those of you joining Congregation Door for Door in person and those of you joining us via live stream. I am Marty Nidell, the president of Congregation Door for Door. Congregation Door for Door is a Reformed synagogue located in Oyster Bay. We are proud to be a sponsor and a host of this special event featuring Representative Steve Israel in conversation with retired General David Petraeus. This is one of several events we will be sponsoring in conjunction with our ongoing partnership with Cornell University and the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, with which Representative Israel is closely involved. Please watch for announcements of future events. Congregation Door for Door is very much involved in providing programs that are not only meaningful and inspiring for our congregants, but also for the local community. This coming Saturday night, January 20, at 7:30 in the evening, we will be having a special Broadway by the Bay concert featuring 5 Broadway stars who have had leading roles in top Broadway shows, singing Broadway show tunes. There are flyers for this event in the lobby. I share regards from our Rabbi Stephen Moskowitz, who is on sabbatical for this month. Before we start our program, I would like to thank our elected officials who are present. Former members of Congress Peter King, Max Rose, and Christopher Shays, and current state legislator Charles Levine. I am very pleased to take this opportunity to introduce our congregation's friend, Stephen Israel. Steve Israel. Steve Israel served in the U.S. Congress from 2001 to 2017, including 4 years as chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He left Washington unindicted and undefeated to pursue new passions. In 2021, he opened Theodore's Books, a small independent bookstore here in this historic hometown of Oyster Bay, fulfilling a lifelong dream. As an author in his own right, Mr. Israel has published 2 critically acclaimed satires of Washington, The Global War in Morris and Big Guns. He proudly serves on the Library of Congress Madison Council, as well as many other boards of directors. Steve was most recently appointed by President Biden to the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. He lives here in Oyster Bay, not far from our synagogue. General David Petraeus is a retired U.S. Army general and widely respected as a leading warrior intellectual. He graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and earned a PhD from Princeton University. He served for 37 years in the U.S. Army, culminating his time in uniform with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, U.S. Central Command, and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He then served as director of the CIA. He has held academic appointments at 6 universities and currently is a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale. General Petraeus is a prominent commentator on contemporary security issues, military developments, and global affairs. He is currently a partner in a major investment firm and chairs that firm's Global Institute. General Petraeus and Representative Steve Israel will be discussing the General's book entitled Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. In light of current events, we hope General Petraeus will provide us with his thoughts on the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, since this is of great significance to the members of Congregation Door for Door. Let me introduce Representative Steve Israel and General David Petraeus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How about a big hand for Marty Nidell for his leadership? I once told President Obama during a heated conversation that the only thing harder than being president of the United States is being president of a synagogue on Long Island. That is a rough deal. And how about another big hand for General Petraeus, who honors us this evening. And let me also welcome our guests online from Cornell University and its Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, viewing this in Ithaca, throughout the country and around the world. We're so happy that you could join us. Before we get into our conversation with General Petraeus, I know that we have Congressman King here and Congressman Shays from Connecticut and Assemblyman Levine, but there's somebody also very special who's joined us this evening. You don't know his name, but I know he's special to the General. He was born and raised in Afghanistan, became an interpreter for the U.S. Army, joined the U.S. Army, served the United States of America, was able to come to the United States and then rescue his family. Please honor interpreter Fareed Firdos, who's with us today. Fareed, where are you? There he is.
Might I just interrupt
Please.
here, actually, because one of the reasons that he was able to come to America is because of an initiative that then Congressman Israel championed, the Special Visa Program. Hugely important. It was an obligation that we decided we owed to those who served 2 years as battlefield interpreters. So these are individuals who are sharing risk and hardship with our men and women in uniform. Our son, when he was a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader, when I was the commander, had his with him. He was on his third or fourth equivalent of a tour. So we're very grateful for what you did then. We are grateful that this process was created to enable you to come here with your family and to pursue the same American dream that so many others before you have pursued. Thanks again very much. And might I also just offer my thanks as well for the hospitality, for the kind introduction. You know, this is not only hallowed ground because of where we are right here, but it's also hallowed ground because, of course, our mutual great hero, Teddy Roosevelt, spent his formative years here. This is where, of course, he spent his mornings on horseback, as David McCullough would later write about him. And so it's great. And then just finally, you know, not only did Steve Israel leave Congress unindicted, he actually left with enormous respect of everyone who served with him, and I was one of those who had enormous respect for him.
Thank you. So you will see over the next hour there's a bit of a telepathy here. The General mentioned mornings on horseback, and I want to just create some context for this relationship in the next hour or so, or 50 minutes of questioning. I want to begin by sharing with you how we met. I went to Congress and I was assigned to the House Armed Services Committee, which Peter knows has jurisdiction for all national security issues, and then got on the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee.
It's the one that really matters.
That's the one that matters. Why? Because we write the checks, right? I mean, Peter King, he was an authorizer. Oh, boy. But the people who write the checks are the ones that really matter, right? So, I never served in the military. And Long Island, although it has a robust, or had a robust defense industry, no major bases on Long Island, no deep military culture on Long Island. And I began asking the ranking member of the committee, Ike Skelton.
Yep, great man.
I said, how do I learn about national security? And he said, well, the deepest thinker on the issue of learning in the military is Dave Petraeus. And you should get to know him. And we met, and that began a series of conversations that occurred in Washington, D.C., at CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, at the Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, which you were kind enough to visit, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Oyster Bay when he visited Sagamore Hill just before COVID. And one day he came into the office in Washington with a book, Mornings on Horseback, amazing book about Theodore Roosevelt, and he said, Congressman, if you really want to understand present conflict and how to deal with challenges, you have to read. You've got to read. And so read this book. Now it happens to be for sale at Theodore's Books, but
oh, I knew this was coming.
on sale. So let's and that became is really how this relationship developed. So let's begin with a question. The book is Conflict. Now, General Petraeus talks about the need to learn and to read. There's no conflict occurring now, or no future conflict, that you can't begin to prepare yourself without reading. You've got to be able to read about conflict to understand present conflict and future conflict. And two themes emerge from this book that I'd like the general to share with us. One is the construct of strategic leadership. The book traces the evolution of conflict and warfare from World War II to Ukraine. And one of the major themes is that conflict becomes more manageable when you have strong strategic leadership. And the general talks about the four elements of strategic leadership. Take us through those indispensable elements.
So we lay out in the introduction, by the way, of course, I'm co-author with the great Andrew Roberts, great British historian. This is his 20th book, the first one for which he's had a co-author. I knew him very, very well, had done many events with him. He called up right after Russia invaded Ukraine and said, you know, there should be a book that provides the military historical context for the war. Would you be interested in co-authoring it? And I jumped at the chance. I was looking for an opportunity to write about Iraq and Afghanistan, having obviously been privileged to command both of those, and then to revisit Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Vietnam. But I didn't want to do the Iraq and Afghanistan as a memoir or a tell-all. I just wanted to lay out the military history. So I was delighted to do that. And I said, but in the introduction, Andrew, what I'd like to do is lay out the intellectual construct for strategic leadership, that at the very top of the effort, because I think that you will find that as we look at these subsequent cases, that what determines success or failure is the quality of the strategic leadership. And I actually developed this particular construct when I was between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq. I used it explicitly during the surge in Iraq, then at U.S. Central Command responsible for the greater Middle East, and then Afghanistan, CI, and so forth. And I've watched it then since as a partner in one of the great investment firms of the world, KKR, where we own 120 companies and have minority investments in another 100 or so. And it works there as well. And I'll actually recount that. Netflix is a great example of great strategic leadership. But this lays out that there are 4 tasks of the strategic leader. The most important by far is the first one, because this is where the leader has to get the big ideas right. You have to craft the right strategy based on a very detailed understanding of your forces, the enemy forces, the physical terrain, the human terrain, the neighborhood, how the country is supposed to work, how it really works, all of these details. In the case of Iraq, the different religions, the sects, the tribes, the political parties, all the other elements that are present in that particular context. And I'll note that we didn't have a sufficient understanding of that when we went into Iraq, as we found as we were going along, and I was a 2-star then. That is crucial. So you got to get the big ideas right. You then have to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. By the way, this is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the example the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration. It's attracting great people and hanging on to them as long as you can, developing them, taking care of them even after they leave. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the metrics that you use. And of course, they have to be keyed to the big ideas, tell you how is the strategy doing? Are you winning or losing, making progress or experiencing setbacks? And crucially, it's how you spend your time, because the meetings you have, what you do with your time, going on patrol, which is something we did twice a week, without fail, in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the different meetings and this battle rhythm, as we called it, because this is 7 days a week, not quite 24 hours a day, but close to it. So what you do every single day of the week, what you do a few times a week, twice a week, once, every other week, monthly, quarterly, this really matters. It's how you drive that campaign. And on that battle rhythm, you have events that actually enable you to perform the 4th task, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas so that you can do it again and again and again, because the context changes and they have to be changed along with those changes in the context. Sometimes you do experience setbacks. You've got to take stock of that and again craft what you need to do. So that's how it works, and we set out to do this explicitly during the surge in Iraq. I had this very much in mind. I'll point out, by the way, any leader, and I know we have a room full of leaders, some of whom may actually be strategic leaders at the very top of an enterprise, but every leader at any level has to perform these 4 tasks. The difference is that leaders below the strategic leader perform them within the decisions that have been made by that strategic leader. In other words, you don't get your own big ideas. They have to be nested within the big ideas of the strategic leader. And if those big ideas are wrong, and we didn't get the big ideas right in Vietnam until 1968. By the way, are there any Vietnam veterans in here, just out of curiosity? Stand up, please. Stand up. Thank you. Stand up. First of all, thank you so much for what you did in an era where you probably didn't volunteer. You answered your country's call and you did what the country asked you to do. We did not thank you. In fact, some of you were spat upon when you came home. But more than any other group in America, you ensured that the men and women that I was privileged to lead got the kind of welcome home that you should have gotten. So again, thank you for what you did. But our leadership failed you. We did not get the big ideas right until about midway through 1968, when we finally realized that the focus of our effort should be the security of the Vietnamese people. Yes, you got to go kill bad guys, but you don't turn what was a small war into a big war, a big unit war. You don't kill more bad guys or create more bad guys than you take off the battlefield by the way you conduct your operations. Very, very widespread use of dumb bombs, mad minutes, unobserved harassing and interdicting fire, and really never getting to know the people that we ostensibly were supposed to be really securing, and left that to these other elements and so forth as the big war went on. Incredible courage, great initiative, advances in technology, lots of really items to be proud of throughout that period, but we did not get the strategy right. And by the way, that follows the French. Think about a bad big idea. The French actually, they were frustrated that the guerrillas wouldn't fight them, the communist Vietnamese, the Viet Minh. So they said, you know what, we'll create this big base and it'll be so attractive, they'll finally actually come to battle. We'll do it way out at the edge of our air power too, by the way, to make it really difficult for ourselves. Dien Bien Phu, and yeah, it's surrounded by mountains, but you know, they'll never get the artillery up on those hills. And the Vietnamese did. The communists, they took apart the howitzers piece by piece, put them up, reassembled them, carried the ammunition up, and they just hammered Dien Bien Phu until it ultimately surrendered. So again, a terrible idea. So that's the process here. And I'll very, very quickly just to illustrate it with Netflix, because it's a great case. Reed Hastings, who was the CEO of Netflix until just recently went up to be chairman now, who really built the Netflix we know, oversaw 4 incarnations, and I discussed this model and those incarnations with him. The first was, we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, so we're going to undersell Blockbuster. They do such a fantastic job that Blockbuster, of course, goes out of business. Test question, where's the only one left in the continental United States? Big Bend, Oregon. Good answer, yes. It is a seriously contrarian place. It will not let its Blockbuster die. And now those of my generation who are here, we can take our grandkids out there and show them how granddad and grandma used to rent movies on Friday nights for the weekend. So that was the first big idea. Second big idea, he sees the context has changed. So now broadband speeds are fast enough that we can allow people to download movies. So that's the new big idea. They communicate it, they oversee the implementation, they get down here a couple of years later, how we doing? Well, we're bigger than ever. It's going great, but now, of course, people are doing what we're doing. So what do we do now? $100 million on House of Cards alone. We're gonna make our own content. Breakout moment for Netflix. Just has carried it to this day. And of course, created all of these iconic series and so forth, and movies and everything else that built Netflix to such a degree. Fourth big idea, he decides, you know what, let's make major motion pictures. And he goes out and buys not 1, but 2 major movie studios. And they do so well, how about a good metric? They got more Academy Award nominations 3 years ago than any other major movie studio. So they did really well in that one. This is where I took issue with him. I said, you know, that movie that had Brad Pitt playing General McChrystal, my close combat friend for 4 or 5 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, I said, it just didn't work. I mean, Brad Pitt and Stan McChrystal wasn't a little wooden soldier. He didn't salute stiffly. He had a sense of humor. And I said, besides, I just cannot believe that Brad Pitt did not hold out to play me. But you get the idea. So we're going to come back to this repeatedly because life actually in general is all about big idea. I mean, it's big ideas about your family. It's big ideas about, again, nonprofits. It's big ideas about congregations. And I'm sure that they are contentious. And that's the way it should be. But that's the construct. And we'll come back to that again and again, as we do in the book, as we look at each of these different cases.
So the first theme is that intellectual construct of strategic leadership. You open up with the Chinese Civil War. You contrast Mao's strategic leadership to Chiang Kai-shek. You end contrasting Zelensky's strategic leadership versus Putin's deficiencies.
Let me quickly talk about that. I mean, Zelensky, first big idea. I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. Because remember, everybody's trying to say, hey, you can set up a government in exile in London. I think we offered to take him to Western Ukraine. You know, Kyiv's going to fall. He says, no, I'm staying. My family's going to stay. We're going to fight for Kyiv to the death. We're going to mobilize the entire country. Every male is going to stay in the country, and that's just for openers. His communication skills, of course, are just, I mean, he's been called Churchill with an iPhone. He's spectacular. He should be. He's an actor. You know, he was a comedian who played the president of Ukraine so well as a comedian, he got elected president. And so those skills, you know, he addressed our Congress, actually the first wartime leader to address both houses of our Congress since Winston Churchill. Actually, and by the way, Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts of Belgravia now, wrote the best single volume biography of Churchill. Also Napoleon, by the way, has a very dim view of the movie, I might add. But so great communication skills. Think of how he oversees the implementation. The example, he changes into a uniform on day one and he's never been out of it since. He goes to the front lines, unlike Putin who sits at the end of a long marble table. He's sharing risk and hardship with his soldiers. He's driving the campaign plan, et cetera, et cetera. And then they are periodically refining the big ideas to do it again and again and again. Everything's not completely sweetness and light. I was out there twice just in the last 6 months alone. There are undercurrents, there's politics, there's some other things at play. But by and large, a truly extraordinary strategic leader, although unfortunately, this war is not over. And he's fighting a country that has a president who is a grievance-filled, revanchist, revisionist view of history, doesn't seem to care about casualties, empties out the prisons and uses them as cannon fodder, has an economy has a population much more than 3 times the size of Ukraine's and an economy 10 times the size. So for all of Putin's shortcomings and misassessments and so forth and failure as a strategic leader, this war is not over. For what I'll just offer right here. By the way, I am totally non-political. I don't even register. I stopped registering to vote as a 2-star and have never started. I give advice to members of either party, as some here know, but I don't contribute or support. And so when I offer assessments about things, look, I believe that Ukraine is about as right versus wrong as it gets in life. A brutal, unprovoked invasion of a country by a kleptocrat who doesn't believe that country has a right to exist. Henry Kissinger rightly said that NATO's security now begins at the Ukraine-Russia border, and the sooner that your successors in the House in particular can get their act together and agree with the Senate on this supplemental bill that will provide the additional assistance that Ukraine so desperately needs, also for Israel, also for Taiwan, and also for our southern border, the better off we'll be.
We're going to talk about Gaza. We're going to talk about other conflicts around the world. But I want to flesh out the second theme in the book, and that is that in order to win the war, you must keep the peace, counterinsurgency. The book makes the point that as much as technology changes, we're dealing with robotics and AI in military operations, as advanced as it gets, one of the timeless lessons that the general teaches is that you've got to ensure that local populations are safe against insurgencies. And I know Peter King and Chris Shays and I saw that. How many dozens of times have you been in theater, you and Chris? The importance of a counterinsurgency effort. And help us understand what that means. And why was it so difficult for the military to embrace that? Why is it so difficult to plan for a counterinsurgency? Or was it difficult to plan for a counterinsurgency until you exhibited the leadership you did on that issue?
Well, we had made a very determined effort to consign everything that we learned and should have learned from Vietnam to the ash heap of history. We decided we don't like doing that. We don't want to do it again. We even structured our forces so it would be very difficult to do in the future. We eliminated it from our professional military education courses, as you know, because you watched as we reintroduced it. We didn't even have a doctrinal field manual for it. So unless you had sort of an understanding of this, I had a fascination with it for some reason from a very early on in my military career. I was fascinated by some of the French leaders. There were some incredibly good French leaders. It was their strategic leadership, again, that largely failed them in Algeria as well as in Vietnam. Studied the British in Malaysia. We first introduced hearts and minds. I actually served in Central America. It was a temporary duty period for the Commander-in-Chief of Southern Command, somebody I worked for 3 different times. Eventually he was the Supreme Allied Commander. I was his speechwriter over there. Saw El Salvador, which was a textbook case. And we also had great partners, and we were able to do it with a very small number of trainers as opposed to having to do the fighting for them. So I had this fascination with it. But very, very few people did, frankly. And remember that the moment we left Vietnam, we refocused on the Central Europe issue of NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. We're much more comfortable with big armies, tanks, fighters, major surface combatants, and all the rest of that, and very frustrated by these wars among the people, which is what counterinsurgency is. But what happened is, of course, we got to fight the war we wanted to fight, the Gulf War. I mean, Saddam he was sent from central casting for the US Army in particular. I mean, we even trained in the Mojave Desert, all tank on tank, no civilians on the battlefield, no jungle, just open, air power can be brought to bear, all of this. And he decided to do that. And of course, the rest of the world took notice. And they said, the last thing we ever want to do is go toe-to-toe with the US military. Let's fight them in irregular ways, irregular warfare. And of course, that's what we ended up having to do. You can argue policies and so forth, but once we're into these, and we didn't go about it the right way. I'll talk maybe perhaps in the case of Iraq quickly, because I was there as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, and the only period I wasn't was when we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual, overhauled all of the preparation of our forces, the scenarios for the mission rehearsal exercise, all of our commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer schooling and everything else. And so that our forces were really prepared by the time we actually went back. I went back for the surge as a 4-star. But we went in, and the initial campaign was a conventional campaign. I was part of that. I was a division commander. And it went much more rapidly than we thought. Our forces, this is a really professional force. This is what we do, tanks and attack helicopters and all the rest of this, topple the regime. And then it turned out we had not at all thought through the post-conflict phase, certainly not adequately. I should note, before we actually went into Iraq, they called us all back, and it was really a bit of a nuisance because we're all out in the desert floor. We're trying to uncoil. We had 5,500 vehicles, 254 helicopters, massive numbers of, it's just spread all over the desert floor. Anyway, we have to get on a helicopter, fly 60 miles back into Kuwait City and have this final powwow. So we do this, we all gather, and at the end of it, they said, anybody got any more questions? I said, excuse me, can you give us just a little more detail on what happens after we get to Baghdad and take down the regime? And there was a retired 3-star in charge of that, and he said, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. So we're in the fight to Baghdad in the 101st Airborne Division. We do the first major urban operation. It's 3 days of tough fighting. All of a sudden, the enemy just collapses. And I call up my boss, and I said, hey, boss, we got good news and bad news. Good news is we own Najaf. What's the bad news, he asked. We own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? It's a city of 400,000 people, the holiest city in all of Shia Islam, and the entire governing structure has completely disappeared. He said, hey, call that guy down in Kuwait that said, you get us to Baghdad and we'll take it from there. He said, let's try it in Najaf. So I called him up, and first there was no answer. Then we finally got through on some kind of radio wire integration thing, and they said, we're still sort of getting organized down here, we'll see you in Baghdad. And then we take Baghdad, and of course that organization gets fired right away. Rumsfeld's frustrated with them. He brings in a new ad hoc organization. Big lesson, always use existing organizations, not pick up teams in the middle of a fight. But then the Coalition Provisional Authority head, the ambassador assigned to that, decides that, you know what we should do? We will fire the Iraqi military without telling them how we're going to enable them to provide for their family. It's hundreds of thousands of military-aged and trained males with weapons whose incentive now is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And then we compound that by firing the entire Ba'ath Party, which is the only party. It's a one-party government. Everybody in the government is Ba'ath. But it is Saddam's party, so I got it, fired the top levels. But when they fired level 4, this is tens of thousands of the bureaucrats we actually needed to run a country we didn't understand. And by the way, most of them were Western educated in some fashion. Many of them even drank. I mean, what more could you ask for partners in the land of the two rivers? So that was a terrible start, and it set us back. We were already up in Mosul by that point. I already had a governor. I had a province council. We were running elections. We were training Iraqi security forces. We had the university reopened. 120 professors, tenured professors, were Ba'ath level 4. They're all fired. I got a special dispensation to get them back. I was able to conduct my own reconciliation. That was the flaw. It's one thing to fire people, but have it a process so that you can actually reconcile. And they refused to have that process. So they gave me the authority, I did it. But it eventually fell apart until the surge. That was one of the elements of the surge. So anyway, eventually we established an embassy, which we should have done at the outset instead of letting the Pentagon run this, do it with the state the way you should normally do it. Got the existing organizations, Corps of Engineers, contracting agencies, et cetera, working, crafted the right organizational architecture, had the big ideas right. General Casey came in, as you'll recall, finally had a 4-star. And then there was an event, though, that invalidated it. And it took us a number of months to realize that. This is when I was back in the States. It was February 2006. Remember, the surge would start in early February of 2007. And we realized that the bombing of a Shia mosque in a Sunni area set off a cycle of violence, of sectarian violence, that just escalated out of control. And it invalidated the strategy of handing off to the Iraqis, consolidating on big bases, and going home. So the president finally, after the disastrous midterm for the Republicans' election of November 2006, he gets a new defense secretary, gets a new commander, a new ambassador, and empowers us incredibly. By the way, that was a courageous decision by him. His own military opposed him. One of them said, "Mr. President, I'm afraid it'll break the service." He said, "General, what'll break the service is losing a war." And he was right. And he sent us back over there, empowered us. I gave him, by the way, a signed copy of the Counterinsurgency Field Manual in the Oval Office. And what we did was the big ideas. The surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces, as valuable as they were to implement the new strategy. It was the change in big ideas. Change leadership doesn't get any more dramatic than 180 degrees, which is what we did. We completely reversed what we had been doing over the objections of the Iraqi prime minister, who had issued a set of demands through his national security advisor to continue to do what they'd been doing and accelerate it. And I said, we want to fail faster. I remember telling the national security advisor, if that's what the prime minister truly wants to do, I would appreciate him telling that to President Bush tomorrow. This is day 3 for me of the new job. Tell the president tomorrow I will be there in my first such meeting where the president and the prime minister do a video conference. But he should know that if he decides to do that, he's going to do it without me, because I'm going to be on the next plane to Washington, and I intend to take the policy with me. Didn't sleep that night, needless to say. Went to the meeting, never heard about it again, and we went on and did what we needed to do. But essentially, job 1, so I actually issued my own counterinsurgency guidance, and it was a series of admonitions. The first one was secure and serve the people. You must have security. Without security, security can be 90% of the problem or 10%, but whatever it is, it's the most important percent, because without it, nothing else is possible. we're going back downtown. We are going to take back over from the Iraqi security forces. We're going to rebuild them. We are going to reassume responsibility for security. This is 77 additional locations we had to fight for just in the Baghdad area alone, city of not quite 7 million people. We are going to promote reconciliation. We cannot kill or capture our way out of industrial strength insurgency. This is not hugely popular because this means you're going to sit down with people who have our blood on their hands. We did it. We worked out a construct for it, a whole intelligence organization to support this. Going to pursue the irreconcilables, the leaders of the extremist organizations and insurgent groups, even more relentlessly than we had been with our special mission units. And by the way, we have a great shipmate in here somewhere who was helping us with this. We were doing 12 to 15 targeted operations every single night with our counterterrorism forces, joined by the British as well. We are going to even more closely integrate civil and military, because what you do is you clear an area with your main forces, you target the leaders, you then hold it and you rebuild it, and that takes civil expertise. And we had a whole series of positions that were filled by people with certain expertise in that. And then you bring back the host nation, the local institutions, rebuild their security forces, you thin out gradually. By the way, part of this is when we were clearing large urban areas, which we did a lot, none as challenging as Gaza, and we'll get into that, but we created gated communities inside these. So Fallujah, we finally got it right the third time, and we created something like 12 or 13 neighborhoods, and they had one entrance and access, and we would then give biometric ID cards immediately to everyone. I mean, this is a real industrial strength. We knew how to do this stuff by that point in time, but it took us a number of years to develop that expertise, to distill it, counterinsurgency field manual and other manuals as well, because there's lots of other detailed ones in various aspects, and then to execute it. By the way, there was another one, and there were a number of these. I mean, there was one that said walk. There's another one that said take off your sunglasses. There was one that said promote initiative. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. But we needed to empower them. And we were confident enough by that point in time that they understood the intent that I had at the very top level, all the way down at the level where they were translating that into actions under body armor and Kevlar with a weapon, doing what only they could do outside the wire, which is to engage the enemy and engage the population. But population security is critical. And I'll add just one final item. We always had in all these 5 combat commands, as you mentioned, there's a sign on the wall of the op centers. You had these huge, it'd be as big as this, with tiered seating and lots of displays and everything else. And there was a sign staring me in the face, and it asked a question: will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates? If the answer to that is no, in other words, it's going to create more bad guys because of the way the operation's carried out, you're supposed to go back and re-examine it, figure out how you get to yes. And if you still can't do it, then you really probably need to take a knee for a while.
We're going to go to Israel in just one moment. I'm just reflecting, listening to you. One of the most vivid experiences that I had in Iraq was visiting with General Ray Odierno, who at the time was commanding the 4th Infantry Division.
Yes, that was in the beginning.
In Balad.
Yep.
I know that, and I won't argue with you. Yes, decreed. And I asked him the question that most members of Congress ask generals: what do you need? I thought the answer was going to be, here's my list of appropriations that I need. Right. Here's my list of technology. And this is what he said: I need more linguists. I need more NGOs. I need people who understand tribal dynamics. Yep. I need more foreign area officers. Yep. I need soft power. I've got all the hard power I need. I need soft power.
Yep. And you know, he's obviously exactly right. We didn't have enough of that. And eventually what we did, we created these provincial reconstruction teams that were at every full colonel and above, so that when we took control of an area, you basically had people with civilian expertise. The problem was that we had far more requirements than the State Department could fill. They then went out and brought people back on active duty that were required. We had a huge number of former ambassadors. It was really impressive to see them volunteer to do this. And then we still didn't have enough, so we went out into the reserve components, and we were very specific about what we needed. The personnel people identified them, brought them over in uniform, brought them on active duty, and then put them in civilian clothes. So we're clear that they were doing those kind of missions rather than, again, conventional military operations. But it's a hugely important. We also, the ambassador and I actually created a civil military campaign, but we built on something that our predecessors had done, but took it to another level. And I remember we sent the document back, so we both signed it. So it's integrated completely. It's not, military and civilian. It's totally all together. And I sent it back, and the word came from the Pentagon, hey, they're concerned that you got a lot of civilian crap in your campaign plan. And I said, well, that's because it's a civil military campaign plan. Right. But that's what it has to be. It was much more difficult to do in Afghanistan because Iraq was a US-led multinational force. There was no other. I had a NATO chain of command, though. In Afghanistan, you had many, many more international folks. The complexities there were much greater in that regard, and in a number of other ways. I actually went back, in fact, I had a very good relationship with Secretary Rumsfeld. It started all the way back when I was in Bosnia prior to these wars starting. I was there for a year doing a combination of the operations chief for the NATO force that was there, and also in my US hat, the deputy commander of a clandestine joint task force doing the war criminal hunt with special mission units. And then we did counterterrorism right after 9/11 as well. The first counterterrorism operation after 9/11 was not in Afghanistan. It was actually in Sarajevo. And it turned out there was a pipeline that went from Pakistan into Sarajevo and also Tuzla, our own base, believe it or not, and then they would disappear into the Schengen zone. So we shut that down. But I pushed back on him one time very early on, and he was a huge supporter ever after that, frankly. What that meant, though, was you constantly got asked to do stuff. So I get home as a 2-star, and within 6 weeks, I'm asked to go back to Iraq and do an assessment, come back, report out why the security forces didn't do well except up in our old area, laid out a series of recommendations. Of course, you know what that's going to be. Okay, go back over and implement them. But at the end of that 3-star tour, which he also extended, he said, hey, I want you to come home through Afghanistan. And I came back, and I gave him an assessment of the situation there. And I laid out on the first slide, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq. And I said, look, I know the level of violence in Afghanistan is much, much lower than that in Iraq. But I'm here to tell you, Afghanistan is going to be the longest of the long wars. And that turned out, sadly, to be true. The sanctuaries the Taliban had in Pakistan, the lack of infrastructure, lack of money, lack of education, lack of literacy, all of these challenges were just really quite substantial. That doesn't mean that we had to leave. I believe very, unlike Vietnam, which truly was, in the end of the day, not sustainable. We just couldn't continue it. We had to find a way out. Afghanistan, we only had 3,500 troops. The measures of sustainability, the big ideas on sustainability are, what does it cost in blood and what does it cost in treasure? We had not lost a soldier in 18 months, and not because of the flawed agreement that the previous administration reached, but because we were no longer in the front lines. Yes, it was a frustrating situation. Yes, our Afghan leaders were very imperfect, maddeningly so. Yes, the situation had eroded. Yes, the Pakistanis were duplicitous. Yes to all of that. But I believe very strongly that the situation, however, again, imperfect, was far better than it was likely to be if what I expected transpired. And sadly, that was the case. And I think it also sent a message to Vladimir Putin that, you know what, you probably can invade Ukraine and get away with it. Now, I think we did a very good job in responding to that and keeping the alliance together, albeit with a number of decisions that took far too long.
Let's go to Israel. And by the way, it is impossible in 1 hour to cover the intricacy and the details that the general covers in this book, and he covers every conflict, again, from World War II to Ukraine in vivid detail. So make sure you get the book, and you can pick up what we may have not had time to do. But let's go to Israel. You deal with all of Israel's wars, not including Gaza, because Gaza erupted after the book came out. And you say there are a lot of parallels between the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and 10/7. And one of the things you say about the 1973 Yom Kippur War was that it rocked the American defense establishment to its foundations. What were the lessons learned for the American defense establishment from the Yom Kippur War? And then we'll talk about your assessment of Gaza.
Well, the Yom Kippur War was the most studied war, I think, certainly in modern history. I forget the number of the dozens, many, many dozens of U.S. assessments alone of what took place. An awful lot of what we were looking at in that case, and this was just as I was entering the service. I graduated from West Point in 1974. A lot of it was to see what happened in modern warfare on a conventional battlefield, having just spent 20 years in Vietnam and that focus. And we're now transitioning to a focus on, again, major forces against major forces. And so you had the advent of the first ever anti-tank guided missiles. You had shoulder-launched, you have shoulder-launched air defense systems. You obviously had a disastrous intelligence failure that, again, an awful lot of hard looks at that. But then you have this brilliant counterattack that takes place, combined arms operations that are really quite extraordinary. You know, this, unlike 10/7, by the way, the Yom Kippur War, there was a moment of existential threat to Israel. The Egyptians achieved so much more than they ever dreamed they would that they were totally unprepared to exploit their success. And they could have. They really could have kept on going. And that could have been disastrous because Israel is scrambling now to call up the reserves, as always. And you have a number of really close calls. I don't know how many of you have stood on the Golan, and I talked to one of the heroes of the Golan, the one that literally, you know, there's sort of one guy in one tank, and he's just holding them all off until the additional reserves can arrive. And to stand up there and to see what took place and to realize how they fought that, the individual initiative. I mean, one of the hallmarks of the Israeli Defense Forces always, I think, has been, again, in the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. And that's exactly what they do. It's a cultural predisposition, I think, that guides them incredibly well in unexpected circumstances. So there was a lot of very, very hard look. And out of that came the so-called Big Five, when you look at the Army, for example. The Abrams M1 Abrams tank, the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle, the Apache attack helicopter, the Black Hawk, certain 155 millimeter howitzer, self-propelled, and so forth. And these were the systems that then, armed with other lessons, we did take a lot of lessons from Vietnam about personnel system, go to an all-volunteer force, professional force, longer enlistment instead of shorter conscription. Don't rotate people, rotate units. This is crucial. You know, we fought Vietnam endlessly over and over and over and over again because, of course, we're just replacing people, and then we only kept commanders in there for 6 months out of a 12-month tour and then pulled them to the rear. So again, this turbulence that we had there, it's very hard to be a learning organization. So a lot of this that came out, and then the importance of really rigorous training. And when you go to the Mojave Desert as an Army battalion commander, as I did in fact, or brigade commander, you're fighting against an opposing force that is literally professional. They know every nook and cranny of this vast training area, the National Training Center. And you get your butt handed to you repeatedly, and they want to put pressure on you. If a unit's doing well, they'll just amp it up some way. So they want to see whether the commander cracks under pressure or not. So all of a sudden you have real military readiness. And unlike the body count in Vietnam, which is both the wrong metric, yeah, you got to kill bad guys, but what we should have focused on is security of the people, first and foremost. But then it also became corrupted. Integrity was undermined by that as well. Now you get integrity into the readiness system. So all of that came out of that, and that the result was the Army, the Marine Corps, the military that rolled over Saddam's forces in a 100-hour ground war after pounding them for 41 days from the air.
Gaza.
Okay, so let's start first 10/7. I want to talk a bit about that. I want to talk about the context of what Israel experienced, and then the challenges of urban combat in Gaza, which Andrew Roberts and I believe present the most fiendishly difficult context of any urban campaign since the end of World War II. And then we'll talk about the ongoing campaign and perhaps even the possibility of a wider war. 10-7 was both an intelligence and a military readiness failure. It's an intelligence failure because despite certain analysts actually having the plans, they had them for about a year, draft plans of what Hamas ultimately would do, despite reporting what appeared to be rehearsals and a variety of actions that were being taken that were in line with preparing to do what the plan laid out. Those above these analysts, starting in the southern region, just said that we can't believe they can do that. So it's a failure similar to that of 9/11, sort of almost a failure of imagination, a failure to appreciate how much Hamas could actually do and how sophisticated an attack they could carry out, however barbaric, unspeakable, and so forth, without question, but nonetheless an incredibly creative and very well-planned attack. And they understood the wall very well. They understood the sensors. They understood the nodes through which the feeds went back to command posts. They knew where the command posts were and ripped the servers and switches out. They disabled the automatic machine guns with little explosives dropped from drones. All of this, again, very, very creative, diabolically clever. And there was also at the strategic level a misassessment that Hamas was actually appreciating the additional worker visas, that they were breaking from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad who had carried out attacks against Israel and they didn't support them. All of this is misinformation, it's all deception. They also, on the Hamas side, seem to understand the sources and methods that Shin Bet has traditionally employed. And I loved Shin Bet as a director of the CIA. Keep in mind, everybody would think the CIA director's partner is Mossad. And yes, it is, that's your principle. But because Shin Bet's outside the United States, we're interested in what they're doing. And they're so incredibly good. They're upstream in the West Bank. They can literally identify an attack and it's all publicly known. The security services of Palestine have support and assistance from our intelligence community. And I've been in Ramallah, for example, a number of occasions. So anyway, they seem to understand, and keep in mind that Hamas, unlike the West Bank, is much more of a denied area to Israeli intelligence. But then at the very senior levels, as I said, there was just a lack of appreciation of what Hamas intended to do, a misreading, almost a wishful thinking about it, that Hamas seemed to feed. And Hamas is probably pushing into the sources and methods that are usually employed, again, disinformation. They even ran their own wire system through the tunnels. So they're communicating on what we would call field wire in the military. You actually run your own, you have a little switchboard and stuff. It's very rudimentary, but it works and nobody can tap it, unlike other systems, as you might imagine. So that was part of it as well. Then it's compounded by, just like Yom Kippur War, it's a Shabbat and an actual religious observance, special one at that. A number of individuals are on leave. Shin Bet also had been focusing a lot more in the West Bank, which seemed to be where the problems were, and of course domestically in Israel, given all of the turmoil, some of which had real security threats. You know, when there's hundreds of thousands of people marching, you never know how that's going to end up. So all of this creates a context in which they can achieve surprise, and then because the military readiness is very, very low, and they don't even have a plan for this, you end up with a really very, very sluggish response. And it's a case where there's some incredible individual heroes, once again, including some retired general officers that went actually to their old unit, drew kit, got in civilian vehicles and just drove down there and started taking charge. So again, extraordinary actions on a day that was marked by obviously truly unspeakable actions by Hamas, who also, of course, filmed it. And I'm sure a lot in here have seen that horrible video. So that's the situation. Now you have to understand, to put it in context for us, We lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. For per capita, what Israel experienced for us would translate into losing about 42,000 people, with another roughly 7,000 taken hostage. So put that context, and I think it's very important to understand Israel's perspective in that regard. Then you look at the setting. This is, again, I cannot imagine a more challenging context in which to fight. Densely populated, 2.3 million people in a relatively small area, but very significant urban areas that don't just have 1 or 2-story dwellings, but some of them are much, much higher. Underneath it all, you have 300 miles or more of very sophisticated tunnel. You have an enemy that knows this area intimately, far better than did, for example, the Islamic State in Mosul when they made that the capital of the Islamic State Caliphate. It took 9 months for the Iraqi security forces, with our help, to clear and hold all of Mosul, my old city, during the first year. You have an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, who hides among the people, who uses civilians as human shields, who holds obviously still well over 100 hostages, some of them willing to blow themselves up to take you with them. Not that many yet, and I hope there will not be more, but that is the most pernicious threat you can possibly imagine, because now you have to treat everyone as a potential suicide bomber, and a vehicle as if they don't observe what you say to do, you end up taking action. And that's very, very challenging. So, and then, we should recognize the IDF. This is not the force that I was privileged to command several years into the war in Iraq, all of whom had year or two in Iraq, in those battlefields and so forth. This is more of a conscript force at the end of the day. It's everyone serves. You don't serve all that long. It depends, again, on the individual field and what they do, et cetera, et cetera. But they've never done urban operations before, at least until you go back to the Beirut or something like that, and that was a different kind of operation than this is. I have felt that the biggest of the big ideas here should be that you should have a counterinsurgency framework with a clear hold and build. Again, if you haven't done it and you haven't practiced it, and it completely surprised, and now then you call up 7% of the workforce is in uniform, and they're reservists. So now I can't imagine something as tough as this. And urban operations takes away a lot of your advantages. You have to go inside sooner or later. Yes, you can take out certain buildings if the target is that important. But again, think of that sign on the wall. You got to make sure you don't create more enemies than you take off the street with the conduct of an operation. They're 3 months into it, have made considerable progress in the north, but there's a lot of fighting left to do. And how long can the economy bear 7% of the workforce in uniform? When can they get them back into the home? And then finally, let me just talk about, you have 3 very clear big ideas, but I would submit, and by the way, I have contact with various Israeli officials and so forth, and also former chiefs of staff and prime ministers that I've talked to just in the last month or two. Clear big idea, destroy Hamas. I believe in that, by the way. I think that's right, and don't stop until you do. This is the Islamic State. This is not an insurgent group you can reconcile with. They are irreconcilable extremists that have to be destroyed. Dismantle the political wing. Clearly cannot allow Hamas to continue to run Gaza. That would just allow the reconstitution. By the way, destruction in military terms, the doctrine means just to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep your eye on without reconstitution, because you need a plan for that, and I don't see that yet. That's a big idea that needs to be developed. They know this, but it's hard because they haven't determined, again, what is the desirable end state. Third big idea, obviously, get the hostages out safely. But there need to be some other big ideas. And I think the sooner they can be resolved, one of those is, I think that Israel's going to have to run Gaza for a period of time. I don't see an alternative. And there's a lot of wishful thinking that other hands are going to go up in the neighborhood. I was just in Dubai at a big annual conference with lots of the leaders. There's nobody who's going to go in there and take on Israel's problem. They want to see Hamas destroyed. This is the twin threats that they hate most or fear most: Islamist extremists and political Islam, which are, again, very nefarious. But I see no alternative. The U.S., I don't think, is going to go in. We're not going to create a coalition force and run Gaza. I'd love to see it. Everyone says it should be Palestinian-led. Absolutely. Show me a competent, capable, trustworthy Palestinian government on deployment orders, and I'd be the first to recommend that I'd put in the request for deployment. But it doesn't exist in the West Bank. So I think they have to. And I think the sooner you acknowledge that, the sooner the military realizes we're going to own this for a period of time at least. Let's act like we're going to own it. And let's be very, very careful about civilian casualties going forward. Yes, there's always the tug of war between necessity, military necessity, and proportionality. Have to be very, very careful with that. Again, remember the sign. And then you have to keep an eye on Hamas so it can't reconstitute. I don't know how you can do that. Okay, you can have free reign. But by the way, I think they have to clear and hold the rest of Gaza. And we're 3 months in and have just done most of the north, a little bit in the center, and just getting started in Khan Yunis. But because we've pushed the people around, the bad guys are among the people. So you got to get the people back into their houses. Remember I said gated communities, you control access, and then you start rebuilding them. I believe as well that there should be a vision provided for the Palestinians in Gaza. We said in Fallujah, Ramadi, Baquba, Mosul, Baghdad, we are going to make life better for you. We're going to get the bad guys out of your midst, and we'd like it if you at least don't impede us. It'd be great if you did actually help, but at least just don't be an obstacle. But we need to get them out of these areas to which we push them back into their homes, however damaged they are, help them rebuild, but control it. So you separate the people, the population from the enemy. So those are using that model, if you will, and then also using what we learned about counterinsurgency, because I think it should be that kind of campaign rather than just thinking of a military conventional campaign.
So separating the reconcilables from the irreconcilables.
Exactly. By the way, they're going to have to use tens of thousands of Gaza, municipal workers. Get over that. You're going to have to do that. Yes, you got to make sure they're not, again, Hamas in civilian clothes. But you need the people that know how to turn the lights back on. You have to restore basic services. They got to push humanitarian assistance in. You got to rebuild. You got to restore schools, clinics, roads, water plants, electricity, et cetera.
Right.
And give them a better life.
Time did not allow us to talk about the Houthis, to really delve into Vietnam, to really delve into Ukraine, but it's in this book. It's all in this book. And before, Lauren's going to come up and give you instructions.
Do you know a bookstore by any chance that might be selling this book?
There may be a bookstore locally. Let me just, as we close, let me just share some of the critical praise for Conflict. A major book that will enlighten the layman and guide the statesman or geopolitical student, Henry Kissinger. General James Mattis, splendidly researched and persuasive in applying history's truism that failure to learn from the past compels us to repeat mistakes. And Admiral Bill McRaven.
The man who got bin Laden. That was a great night.
The guy who got bin Laden, not since Clausewitz is on war. Now that's high praise. Has the book provided so much insight into the nature of warfare. This is indispensable reading to understand the nature of conflict in the past. Written by a true American hero, General David Petraeus. Thank you. Lauren?
All right, please remain seated. If you would like to get a book signed, we're just going to give them a second to get a head start over to the signing table. On behalf of Theodore's Books, I would like to thank you all for coming tonight. And of course, thanks to Congregation Lador Vador for hosting us in your beautiful space. Please check out theodoresbooks.com to see what we have coming up at our bookstore.